Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm David Lair, president of Community Advocates, Inc. Janice is traveling and as we speak and can't be with us tonight. I'd like to welcome tonight's guests, Max Boot and Madeleine Brand, on behalf of the Board of Community Advocates and the Jews United Executive Committee. That includes former Congressman Mel Levine, Janice Kaminer-Resnick, former Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky, Rabbi Ken Chasen, Caroline Kelly, and me. Tonight's guests will offer our first pass at analyzing yesterday's important election results. We'll also be seeking Max's insights into what's going on with Putin, Ukraine, and world tensions everywhere. Next Tuesday, November 15th, when the election results are hopefully finalized or close to finalized, we'll dive into their meaning in even greater depth with a special 2-hour program in partnership with NPR station KPCC. The program will be broadcast on Zoom as usual, but it will also be live for Southern California viewers who can join us at the Skirball Center at 5 p.m. next Tuesday. Our panelists, some of whom will join us in person, include Pulitzer Prize winner Clarence Page, NPR's national political correspondent Mara Liasson, political guru Bob Shrum, Pepperdine University Dean Pete Patterson, and many more. They'll all be in discussion with our frequent host, KPCC's Larry Mantle. In Janice's email after tonight's discussion, you'll have the opportunity to register for the virtual program and the live session. We hope you can join us. We would love to meet you after 2.5 years. In the next few weeks, we will host the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, probably the most prestigious foreign policy think tank in the country, Richard Haass. He served 4 presidents in high-level positions. After that, we have Juliette Kayyem, former Homeland Security official and author of the provocative book, Learning to Live in the Age of Disasters. And now, my colleague Zev Yaroslavsky, who has been a pillar of LA politics for nearly 5 decades, will introduce our guest. He's an essential part of this town hall series. His ideas, his passion, and his willingness to make these sessions special have been invaluable. Zev will introduce our guest and moderator. Zev?
Thank you very much, David, and let me offer my condolences directly to you for the passing of your mother a couple of weeks ago. Tonight, we're really honored to have Max Boot, one of our most frequent guests, a historian, best-selling author, and foreign policy analyst, who has been called one of the world's leading authorities on armed conflict by the International Institute for Strategic Studies. He is the Jean J. Kirkpatrick Senior Fellow for National Security Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and a columnist for the Washington Post. His book, The Road Not Taken, Edward Lansdale and the American Tragedy in Vietnam, was a New York Times bestseller and a finalist for the 2019 Pulitzer Prize in Biography. He is the author of 4 other widely acclaimed books as well. Max has been a CNN analyst and a regular guest on MSNBC, NPR, BBC, and other radio and television networks. He has also served as the op-ed editor at the Wall Street Journal. Max was born in Moscow, grew up in Los Angeles, and now lives in the New York area. We're delighted to have you back, Max. Madeleine Brand is the host of KCRW's award-winning daily news culture show, Press Play. She covers national, international, and local stories through a Southern California lens. She is also the co-host of KCRW's legal affairs podcast, The Legal Eagle Files. Madeleine has hosted and reported for NPR and its affiliate stations for more than 30 years. She has been a frequent moderator on these America at a Crossroads broadcasts, and we're thrilled to have her back. So Madeleine, it's all yours.
Thank you, Zev. And it's a pleasure to be back, especially today. And it's also a pleasure to talk to Max again, because I believe we spoke not so long ago, and things were a lot different now. Things are a lot different now after last night's election. So let's just dive right in. And we are going to get to Russia, of course. You're such an expert on it. We can't let that pass and talk about what's happening in Ukraine. But first, of course, I want to get what you have to say about what has been transpiring over the last 24 hours and is continuing to transpire. And I think it's fair to say that most of the pundits did not predict what happened and what we're seeing now, these various Democratic victories. Everyone was predicting a red tsunami or some version thereof. So what happened? Why is the reality so far so different than what we all had expected?
Well, first, let me just say what a pleasure it is to be back with you, Madeleine, and with Jews United. I think it's a community advocates. I think it's a great organizations and a great forum, and it's really a privilege and a pleasure to be back with this great audience again. In terms of, what happened last night, I mean, I think a friend of mine kind of summed it up this morning where he said, the Republic survived, but just barely. And I think that kind of sums it up. It clearly was not the red tsunami that so many analysts and so many Republicans had expected. It was more like a red ripple or maybe a red puddle or something like that. Anyway, to mix metaphors, a lot of the air leaked out of the red balloon, let's put it that way. And I think, basically ever since, I'm a recovering Republican, and ever since 2016, I've kind of been looking for the Republican Party to finally get the shellacking at an election that it deserves for its blatant embrace of, isolationism, nativism, racism, authoritarianism, rejection of science, all these terrible trends we've seen since the rise of Trump. And I keep thinking, man, it's really got to be whacked over the head with a 2x4 so it'll come to its senses and get back to being a normal party. And that's never quite happened. But if you look at what has happened, from 2018, when they had a massive repudiation in the congressional elections, and that was truly a blue wave election. 2020, when Trump lost to Biden and by a very large margin in the popular vote, and now what happened yesterday, which was, it's still going to be a Republican victory in the House. I think the Senate remains too close to call. It's still up in the air. I think the most likely outcome is the Democrats will probably retain the 50-50 edge. But this is certainly not what Republicans expected, given the fundamentals, which is that we have the highest inflation in 40 years, and we have a president who is not that popular. And the reality is most presidents in a similar situation lose a lot more seats in their off-year election. And that didn't happen this time, I think, largely because the voters are punishing Republicans for being crazy. There is a limit to how much insanity American voters are willing to take. And you saw that with some of the nuttiest candidates running, like Don Baldock up in New Hampshire, Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania. They lost. Now, not all the nutty candidates lost. It may be that Carrie Lake may win as governor of Arizona. That remains to be seen. Herschel Walker is still competitive in Georgia, although he's probably going to lose. But at the end of the day, Republicans severely underperform because they're paying the penalty for this crazy Trumpism that they have embraced. And what you saw yesterday was that kind of normal mainstream Republicans, they did fine. I mean, look at governor's races in Ohio or Georgia or elsewhere. You had very mainstream Republicans who won massive victories with no problem, at the same time that their more MAGA compatriots were either locked in much tighter races or actually going down to defeat. So this is still a bit of a mixed message. It's still not the thoroughgoing repudiation that I would like to see. But I think if Republicans are paying attention, they will see that Trumpism is a major drag on their electoral prospects.
However, the New York Times reports that around 210 people who either denied the election or questioned the election, I guess there's a fine line there, I don't know what it is exactly, including Kevin McCarthy, were elected last night. So that's going to be a huge number of people in governing bodies in the new Congress who are, Trumpists and election deniers. And so I guess if the Republicans do prevail and they win the House, how does Kevin McCarthy and how do the manage that? How do the Republicans govern, if they govern, with all of these people still in power?
Well, I guess the good news from the Republican standpoint is they don't have to worry about governing. They're not interested in governing. They just want to blow things up, so that they can do. But let me address the election deniers point first, which is that, yes, it's true that on sheer numbers, a lot of election deniers got elected. But the key point is they did not win the races in swing states where they would be the ones who are going to be counting the ballots in 2024. The one possible exception, again, is Arizona with Carrie Lake. But in general, if you look at other swing states, you had a repudiation of the election deniers when they were running for governor or running for Secretary of State. And so that actually gives me greater hope for American democracy. It gives me a lot more hope that the votes will actually be counted. And if a Democrat wins in 2024, their election is going to be certified. Now, in terms of what happens in the House, that's a great question, because in some ways, the fact that the Republican margin is going to be so close, and we don't know what it is yet, but it's going to be close, that actually can be a cause for concern, because it means that every single crazy member of the Republican caucus, and there are a lot of crazy members, in the Freedom Caucus, they are going to be able to blow everything up on every single vote. And Kevin McCarthy basically is going to be hostage to people like Marjorie Taylor Greene. There's not going to be any room for error if they want to keep their majority. So in some ways, this is kind of the worst of all worlds in the House, because ideally, from my perspective, the best of all worlds would be if the Democrats keep their majority. But in some ways, it would actually be advantageous if there was a larger Republican majority. And so then the leadership could afford to lose some of the crazies on votes and not cater or pander to them on every single matter. But now they're going to probably have to cater to the crazies on everything. And you're going to have the Freedom Caucus, the worst extremists in American politics. They're always going to be holding Kevin McCarthy hostage, saying, if you don't play ball with us on this, we're going to kick you out of the speakership. And so that is a cause for concern. It's true that they're not going to be able to pass legislation, and they're not interested in passing legislation. But what they want to do is, impeachments. They want to do investigations of Hunter Biden, and they can do some damage there. But the real damage they can do, for example, is if they block a debt ceiling that is necessary to prevent a debt default. Now, I don't think that's necessarily going to happen, but the odds, I think, are probably a little bit higher that it could happen because of that situation that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, we'll play that out. Why is that so important for people who are not fully aware that, or whose eyes glaze over at the words debt ceiling?
Well, this is a stupid rule that we have, where every time we need to, expand debt, you have to have a vote in both houses of Congress to authorize it. That shouldn't be the case. They should simply pass a rule that allows the Treasury to automatically expand borrowing. But what happens is then this provides an opportunity for the Ted Cruz's and others of the world to stand for a showdown, basically threatening to close down the government and to default on the debt unless they get their non-negotiable demands, whatever those demands might be. But if they actually don't pass the debt ceiling and we default on the debt, that is very, very bad. I mean, that could lead to a collapse of the financial markets. That is a serious, serious consequence, which is why we've never come close to doing that. But, try explaining that to, Marjorie Taylor Greene. Does she get it? I don't know. Probably not.
But then the Mandarins, the Mitch McConnells of the world, do they?
Yeah, no, I mean, Mitch McConnell gets it, but again, and I think Kevin McCarthy gets it, but as I say, it may not matter if they're truly, hostages of a small part of their caucus. Now, I'm not predicting this is going to happen. I think it's still an unlikely scenario, but I think it's certainly something that's worrisome, because there are moments where they have, leverage, and you're going to see another, interesting debate occur over aid to Ukraine, where, Marjorie Taylor Greene said they're not going to spend one more dime for Ukraine. And Kevin McCarthy had a more measured version of that message, saying they're not going to have a blank check for Ukraine. But what's going to happen in the House is there's still going to be a majority to favor aid to Ukraine. It's going to be it won't be that hard to assemble that majority, because Democrats will be in favor, and there's going to be about half the Republican caucus is going to be like normal Republicans who will support it. But then the issue becomes, is Kevin McCarthy willing to buck the MAGA element of his own party? Is he willing to incur the wrath of Donald Trump and people like that to push aid to Ukraine, which is becoming anathema on the far right? That's the question. And, then you're kind of gambling on, does Kevin McCarthy have a backbone? And I've seen no evidence so far that he does, but perhaps he will grow on if he becomes speaker.
Well, let's talk about Mitch McConnell then on the other side, and game this out for me. If Carrie Lake, she's still, as you mentioned, in a pretty close fight with Katie Hobbs to be governor of Arizona, there are fewer than 5,000 votes separating the two. And I'm sure that should she be declared the loser, she will not concede. She's a staunch election denier, after all.
Right.
So I guess I'm wondering, given what's happened and McConnell being the pragmatist and the realist that he purports to be, and he sees what has happened, the shellacking that the Republican Party received yesterday, how does he react to this then? Does he try to stamp this out, this election denying, or does he play footsie with her and the others who are also still in the throes of Trumpism?
I mean, I think, McConnell and McCarthy have had different strategies. McConnell's strategy towards Trump has basically been to ignore him and pretend that he doesn't exist, whereas McCarthy's strategy is basically to kowtow to him and kiss up to him. And a lot of that is driven by their caucuses, because the House Republican caucus is much Trumpier than the Senate Republican caucus, although the Senate Republican caucus may become marginally more Trumpy because J.D. Vance won in Ohio and he's a major Trumpkin. So they will find their own strategies. I think the larger issue here, Madeleine, is, how does the party treat Donald Trump going forward? Because this is another opportunity to get rid of the albatross around their neck. It's pretty obvious that Trump is not only a threat to American democracy. Okay, let's say Republicans don't actually care about American democracy, but they care about their own political fortunes. And Donald Trump is a drag on their own political fortunes. He was the first president since Hoover to lose both houses of Congress and the White House within 4 years of being elected to office. And now he continues to drag them down with a lot of these nutty candidates that he pushed over the finish line in the primaries, like Dr. Oz, the quack medicine peddler in Pennsylvania. And that's costing Republicans control of the Senate. If they just had more normal mainstream candidates in states like Pennsylvania or New Hampshire or others, they would probably have a working Senate majority right now. So, and people know that, they understand that Trump is trouble, but do any of them have the cojones to stand up to Trump, to take the abuse that comes from calling him out and challenging him? And I think you're going to see an interesting decision ahead for Ron DeSantis, who is now kind of the flavor of the month because he won by 20 points in Florida, much bigger than Trump's margin there in 2020. And a lot of people are talking him up as the hot new thing, the new, presidential candidate for the Republican Party. But Trump isn't going to go away. He's a narcissist. He can't surrender at the stage. So, is DeSantis willing to challenge Trump for the Republican nomination? If he does, I mean, it's possible he could win, but in the process, he would have to take an enormous amount of abuse, which has only just started with, Trump giving him one of these lame nicknames, Ron DeSanctimonious. But that's just the beginning. I mean, he's going to have a pile of, of horse manure dumped on his head by Donald Trump every single day if he's running against them. And so the issue, really is somebody like Ron DeSantis man enough to stand up to that, or is he afraid he's going to suffer the same fate as Marco Rubio or Ted Cruz or all the other midgets that Trump banished in 2016?
Well, yeah, and Marco Rubio had a great night last night as well. So Marco Rubio has bounced right back. And
I mean, he's bounced back, but nobody's talking about him as a presidential candidate anymore because of the job that Trump did on him in 2016.
Right. And who else is there?
I mean, there's Glenn Youngkin, there's other, there's other supposedly moderate mainstream Republican governors out there who I think would be interested, but are afraid of taking on Trump.
So what does this do to the base, to the voters? Are they energized from last night? Are they deflated? What happens to them? Do they suddenly come to their senses and realize, oh, maybe I shouldn't be an election denier or back an election denier and go back to being the regular Republican Party?
That's a great question. I mean, I think a large portion of the Republican Party is irredeemable, truly in the basket of deplorables, as Hillary put it. So they are, I mean, a big chunk, of the Republican Party is just cult followers of Donald Trump. But that's probably that's not the majority of the Republican Party. You're probably, I don't know, you're talking 30%, 40%, something like that of the Republican Party. They're not going to be dislodged from Donald Trump. For the rest of it, I think that remains very much an open question. I think there are a lot of indications that a lot of Republicans would like an alternative to Donald Trump. But the question again comes back to, is anybody, willing to suffer the abuse necessary to challenge Trump and to provide that alternative? And I think that remains to be seen.
Let's talk about the Democrats for a little bit. What does this do to them and to Biden? As you said, he is deeply unpopular. Inflation is high. People are unhappy with the way the United States is going. Most people in both parties do not like it. And yet here he is having running a victory lap at the news conference this afternoon. And so does he see his prospects differently? Do Democrats see his prospects differently, not only when it comes to running for reelection, but also for governing?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a vote of confidence in Biden. I mean, a lot of people wrote him off and said that his personal unpopularity would be a drag on the party. A lot of people derided him for making democracy a major issue, for calling out the Republicans for their attacks on democracy. A lot of people derided him for saying that he could get, bipartisan legislation through Congress, even with these Republicans. And in a lot of ways, he's been vindicated. He did get the bipartisan legislation through the infrastructure bill, the CHIPS bill, a bunch of other bills. He did make democracy and abortion into major issues that I think really put a ceiling on Republican gains. And I think so. I think he looks stronger. I think he looks vindicated, but that still leaves open the question of, is this guy who's going to be 82 years old or whatever in 2024, is he still going to run for reelection? I mean, I don't know what he's going to do, but that remains an open question. I mean, I think you can sort of speculate. I mean, what happens if Trump gets knocked out? Maybe Biden doesn't feel compelled to run again but if Trump runs, it's kind of an invitation to Biden to run again. So these two old geezers, are going to maybe lumber back into the ring for one more round. And you would have to give the advantage to Biden because, he's not that popular, but he's much less unpopular than Donald Trump.
One of the surprising things after this election was looking at the exit polling and what voters voted on in terms of their issues. Their number one issue, of course, inflation was up there, but abortion was the number one issue for Democrats. It was the number two issue for all voters. Crime was way down. Even for Republicans, it was below abortion in terms of their priorities. And people had been saying, the abortion issue peaked too soon for the Democrats with the Dobbs decision. So were you surprised to see that the voters came out and women came out in strength on the abortion issue?
Yeah, I mean, I was pleasantly surprised. I think certainly after this election, the Democratic National Committee ought to send a fruit basket to A, to Donald Trump, but B, to Justice Alito, because I think Trump and Alito were the ones who prevented a much larger payoff for Republicans on Tuesday. And clearly a lot of women, a lot of men too, were energized by the Dobbs decision and the threat to reproductive freedom. And I think Republicans definitely paid a price for it. Whereas, as you mentioned, I think the crime issue fizzled to some extent because I think a lot of that, frankly, is just hot air from Fox News, where they can cherry pick high-profile crimes. And yes, there was an increase in crime. By the way, it happened in 2020 when Trump was president. And there was, and the numbers differ a little bit, but in terms of violent crime, it's actually not at a higher level than it has been the last few years. And like here, and I'm speaking to you from New York, and actually the numbers on shootings and violent crimes, they're down 30% year on year in New York. So you had a spike, but it's going down. Murders are up. I mean, you can talk about the numbers, but the bottom line is we're not seeing this massive crime wave of the kind we saw in the 80s, which is what Republicans were trying to pretend. And again, I think this is a tribute to the sense of the American people, is that they can detect a phony issue.
Okay, let's switch a little bit and go internationally. You did mention that there's a threat if the Republicans take over to Ukraine in terms of funding the war there, helping fund the war there. We've spent around $15 billion so far.
More than that, I think. Yeah, more than that. I don't have the figure, but I think it's probably, I'd have to look it up, but I think it's closer to, it's north of 20 billion, but yeah.
Oh, by now. Okay. So so has that support monetarily in Congress flagged at all, or is there at this point a pretty strong support for continuing to spend to help?
It's flagged on the right. I mean, it's actually shocking to see. There are surveys asking Republicans whether we're spending too much on aid to Ukraine. And at the beginning of the war, like in March, April, only about 10% of Republicans were saying that we were spending too much. Now, the last survey was about half of Republicans are saying we're spending too much, which is about what you'd expect because the two leading influencers in the Republican Party are A, Donald Trump, and B, Tucker Carlson. And they're both basically shills for Russian propaganda. So of course, a lot of Republicans think that we are spending too much. But I think there is still in Congress, there is still very strong bipartisan support for Ukraine. But again, there's a danger of these MAGA crazies in the House sabotaging efforts to pass aid in the future, which is why I think what the Biden administration needs to do and probably will do, they need to pass a massive aid bill for Ukraine between now and January so that they don't have to rely on the new Republican Congress to get it done.
Do you think militarily the United States should be doing more?
I mean, I think there's some things we could be doing at the margins. I'm not sure why we're not supplying like F-16s, for example, or longer range rockets. There are a few things I wish we were doing, but overall, I think President Biden has done a great job. In some ways comparable to what President Bush did during the Gulf War in assembling this international coalition to stop territorial aggression. And President Biden, I think, has done a great job of keeping our European allies on board. Putin has tried everything to try to fracture the coalition, cutting off gas supplies to Europe, trying to raise energy prices, and it's not working. Right now, I don't see any diminution of European or American support for Ukraine. So I think that's a huge victory for Ukraine and a huge defeat for Russia.
Right. And surprising as it gets colder in Europe and these fuel shortages become apparent,
Right.
and people have had to, I guess they're being warned that there will be some rationing of fuel.
Right.
Um,
Right.
but given, so looking at recent political gains of the far right in Europe, in Italy, in Sweden, Switzerland, other places like that, where in Northern Europe you wouldn't expect such strong gains. What is the longer term future of supporting this war when you look at the rise of nationalist politics in Europe and what may be a winter of discontent when it comes to fuel and other shortages?
Well, hard to know, but again, I think the Europeans have done a pretty good job of stockpiling natural gas and getting ready for the winter. So I don't expect that their support will break over the winter. And some of these populist nationalist movements that are gaining power are actually pretty opposed to the Russian invasion. I mean, even in Italy, where you have members of the coalition who have been, like Berlusconi, for example, who's been very pro-Russian in the past, but the actual Prime Minister Meloni has been pretty decent on Russia and Ukraine. I think Italy is continuing to support Ukraine or even stepping up their support. So I mean, these are all things that you got to keep an eye on for the long term, but I don't see any immediate fracturing of the anti-Russia coalition. And I think what's really driving that is two things. One is that Russia is so heinous. I mean, every report you see about Russian war crimes, and there are so many, is just driving more support for the victims of Russian aggression. And the other thing that's driving support is the fact the Ukrainians are being successful. I mean, everybody wants to be with the winner. Nobody wants to be with the loser. And right now, the Russians are the ones who look like the losers. The Ukrainians are the ones who are winning. And I think if you see the Russians actually retreating from Kherson as the major city in southern Ukraine that they occupied, as their defense minister said they were going to do, if you see that, that's going to further that narrative that the Ukrainians are winning. And that's going to be very helpful, I think, in keeping the pro-Ukraine coalition together in the West.
So the Ukrainians are a little skeptical of that announcement today. They think it might be a trap. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's possible, but it's unlikely. I think you have the Pentagon is saying that they're seeing signs of people leaving. I'm seeing people quoted on the ground in Kherson saying that a lot of the government buildings are abandoned. So yeah, I mean, I have to proceed cautiously and see what happens. But I doubt that this is just a complete, snow job. It's possible, but it's unlikely.
So what would be driving that? Is it because they are losing so many men? I think it's estimated 100,000 have been Russian forces have died.
Yeah, I don't know if that's an accurate figure or not. That sounds a little bit high, but they certainly lost tens of thousands, and they were basically trapped in an untenable position in Kherson because this is a city on the bank of the Dnieper River, and the Russian supply lines are across the river, and the Ukrainians are closing in, and they're targeting the bridges across the river. So the Russians are having trouble supplying the garrison in Kherson, and so the danger for them was that if they left that force in place, it would get trapped and annihilated or captured. That's the last thing they want. And so they basically have no choice because the Ukrainians have had so much success with their counteroffensive. What they're doing now, I think, is very smart. I mean, it's a smart thing to do militarily. They need to consolidate their lines across the Dnieper River. They can have a much more defensible perimeter on the eastern bank of the river than they could have on the western bank of the river. The most interesting thing about this, Madeline, I would say, is the fact that Putin made this decision because there were reports in September that he was telling his generals they were not allowed to retreat because, of course, this would be a humiliation for him. This would be signaling to the Russian people that the war is not going so well. But the cost of avoiding that short-term humiliation could be a much longer and bigger, drawn-out defeat in the long run. And so it's interesting to me if he is, in fact, given the order to retreat, that he is actually acting pretty rationally. And we're all kind of terrified of Putin, like, oh, what if he's losing in Ukraine and he goes nuclear? I mean, what if he just flips out and starts launching nuclear weapons? Well, yeah, I mean, that is a real danger. But I think what we're seeing now is he is not a madman. This is not, Dr. Strangelove in charge of the Soviet Union. This is a calculating, rational dictator. Makes mistakes, but he doesn't want to just destroy his army. He's actually making rational decisions about how to pull back and to, do the best he can do in a military situation, which is trending against them. So I think that's actually a very positive sign because it's an indication that, yeah, Putin does retreat, contrary to the image that he would like to put out there.
And there was a recent report in the Times about how the Russia meddling was really about laying the groundworks for this invasion, that Putin wanted Donald Trump elected over Hillary Clinton because he knew that he would then have a much easier path to invading Ukraine.
Yeah, or just taking it over in some other way. But yeah, and I think one of the good things about the election outcome in this country yesterday was it lessens Putin's hope that Trump and Trumpists are going to take over in the United States and cut off Ukraine. I think the odds of that are going down. As a result of that, I think our credibility and Biden's leverage is going up. So I think the election results send a very positive message of resolution to Russia.
And so should these investigations, getting back to the US and the elections for a second, should these investigations happen when if and when the Republicans take over the House and they start investigating Hunter Biden, as you say, who's on the top of their list? How does that?
The greatest scandal in American history.
I know.
Hunter Biden's laptop. The worst thing that's ever happened to America is Hunter Biden's laptop.
I know, it's just, it boggles the mind. But do you think it will in any way affect the United States' support for Ukraine?
No, I think those investigations, I think Kevin McCarthy probably understands that those investigations are probably going to blow up in Republicans' faces because they don't have anything. This is like, their attempt to make something out of Whitewater, which blew up in their face in the 1990s. I think most voters have a decent BS detector. They can detect a real scandal versus a phony scandal. And this is going to obviously be a phony scandal because they don't have anything, okay? Hunter Biden is a troubled guy, no question about it. But there is no evidence that whatever he's done somehow implicates President Biden in any corruption. It just doesn't exist. So this is like their manufactured scandal, like their claims that the election was stolen, which is another quasi, pseudo scandal they're going to investigate. And the more resources they pour into that, I think the crazier they're going to look and the bigger the backlash will be against them in 2024. So, it's going to be maybe unpleasant. It's going to be unpleasant for Hunter Biden, no question. It's going to be unpleasant for folks in the administration, but ultimately, I think this is going to do more. These crackpot, partisan investigations are going to do more damage to the Republican Party than to the Democratic Party.
But I wonder if it would create enough noise for the average voter who doesn't pay close attention to the details in the news, or maybe doesn't follow the news at all until it's time to cast a ballot, whether all the noise around corruption and the name Biden and Ukraine and all of that stuff serves to function kind of like Hillary and her laptop. It just becomes this overwhelming cloud of, well, it doesn't smell good. It sounds suspicious. I don't like it. The sound of it. I think he's corrupt. Talking about Biden, the father. I'm not going to vote for him. And therefore, effective.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible at the margins. I think the real issue is, what do independents think about this? Because obviously most Republicans are going to be drinking the moonshine, but it doesn't really matter because they're Republicans. So I think the issue is, are they going to be able to sway independents with this stuff? And maybe I'm being naive here and idealistic and out of touch with modern America, but I do tend to think you're probably not going to win a majority of independents unless you actually have something, that just screaming that this is the worst scandal in history is not actually going to convince most people that it actually is the worst scandal in history.
Okay, I want to go back internationally, and then because I see the questions from our viewers, which I'm going to get to in a second, are primarily about the election. So one more international question, or a couple, and this is about Israel. Israel also had a very important election recently, and the left in Israel is pretty much all but dead. And Netanyahu's formed this coalition with these extremist, ultra-right, I'd say, religious nationalists.
Right.
I assume that is the end of any thought of a two-state solution or any peace process with the Palestinians. How does the United States deal with this new government in Israel?
Well, it's disturbing to see what's happening in Israel because, of course, you have, a somewhat analogous situation to here. I mean, a lot of the reason why Trump wants to run for president, aside from the fact that he just loves attention, he thinks that running for president will deflect these criminal investigations away from him because it'll seem too political to investigate a political candidate. And of course, Bibi Netanyahu in Israel he's actually facing a corruption trial. And so clearly he thinks that by becoming prime minister, he's going to be able to escape justice. And he's probably going to be right in that calculation. And so he is, really an unscrupulous character who's willing to do anything to save his own neck. And in this case, cutting a deal with elements of the far right in Israel that had long been considered out of bounds for any mainstream party, followers of Meir Kahane. Really, people who support Jewish terrorism, really people who should be beyond the pale in Israeli politics, could now enter the cabinet. I think that is very disturbing. And I think, the Biden administration will have to figure out how to handle that. I think they've signaled that they don't necessarily they may not deal with these extremists if they get into the cabinet. And I'm hoping that doesn't happen. I'm hoping that there is still a deal to be struck where Lapid and some of the other centrists might be able to make a deal with Netanyahu, distasteful as that would be, that perhaps would allow him to form a government without the extremists. At least I'm hoping that's going to be the case. But no matter what happens, I think to your question, I don't think the peace process isn't really going anywhere with the Palestinians. It was dead before, it's going to be dead tomorrow. But I think there's still, cause for concern about, is the Israeli government going to try to annex, sections of the West Bank, for example? That's something that Netanyahu's talked about doing in the past to appeal to right-wing voters. That would be very destabilizing because even though we don't have a peace process now, Israeli annexations are going to make it very, very hard to ever have a peace process in the future. So that's something we really want to avoid. But in terms of the actual peace process, I think the actual peace process you're going to see is not between Israel and the Palestinians, but between Israel and the Arab states. And I think, the big question now is, will Netanyahu be able to normalize relations with Saudi Arabia? So stay tuned.
And what about Iran? Okay, one more foreign policy question.
Yeah,
Yeah, so we're seeing the protests in Iran, and we're seeing Iran also helping out Russia with Ukraine, sending
yeah.
military supplies to Russia and Ukraine. And so, where do you see that ending up? What's happening in Iran? Is there enough of a political rebellion to actually change the regime there?
I wish I were more optimistic, but unfortunately, the Islamic regime in Iran has shown a lot of staying power over more than 40 years. And it would be, it would be a godsend if the protesters could actually topple the government, but I don't see evidence of that right now. At the moment, what I see is that the government is not strong enough to repress the protests, but the protesters are not strong enough to topple the government. So it's kind of a standoff. And meanwhile, a lot of disturbing stuff is going on, including the fact that Iran is now enriching uranium at a much higher level than they were able to do under the nuclear deal that Trump pulled out of. The Biden administration has tried to revive the deal, but with no luck. And right now, the chief U.S. negotiator a few weeks ago basically said that recognized reality and said the effort is basically dead right now. The Iranians aren't interested, and it's going to be all the harder to reach a deal with Iran now when they are supporting, the Russian war crimes in Ukraine. They are becoming an even bigger outcast in the family of nations than they have been in the past. But they're also becoming even more dangerous because you're seeing in Ukraine that they're kind of road testing their drones and missiles and showing that they have a pretty effective military capability. And of course, they're, within a week, if they wanted to, they could have enough enriched uranium to make a nuclear bomb. So their breakout time has gone from over a year under the JCPOA, the nuclear accord, to basically zero right now. Massive, massive failure for Trump foreign policy, but that's a failure that Biden has not been able to repair. And so there's just not a lot of good options with Iran right now. Like, we're not going to go to war with them. Israel doesn't want to go to war with them, but we don't want them to go nuclear. There's just not a lot of great options. So it's a very troubling situation without an obvious solution right now.
Okay, let's get to some of the questions. Lots of questions about Liz Cheney's future. So here is one. Marion asks, where does Liz Cheney go now?
Go home, I guess. I don't know. I mean,
She
I
run
think
for
Liz
president,
Cheney,
and she has floated that.
she could run for president, but I mean, she's not going to get very far, running for president in the Republican Party. It's possible she could do some good running as an independent candidate if she can siphon off some Republican votes away from the Republican nominee in 2024. That could be a positive thing. I think she did a positive. I mean, I have tremendous admiration for Liz Cheney. She's one of the few Republicans who has really put loyalty to the Constitution above loyalty to the party. And I think she actually did a lot of good in this election where she went out and stumped for moderate Democratic candidates like Abigail Spanberger in the House and in Virginia and several others. And most of those candidates actually won. So I think Liz Cheney is somebody who has credibility with, center right voters, with independent voters, with kind of mainstream Republican voters. And she can put that credibility to use in trying to bolster centrists within the Republican Party, but also within the Democratic Party. And I think that's an important mission. So I'm not sure that she has much of a future in elective office right now, but I think she has an important role to play in U.S. politics and influencing the direction of U.S. politics and nudging it back in a saner and more moderate direction.
Yeah, and so the January 6th committee is apparently finished with its public hearings and is probably trying to get this report out soon. What happens once this report comes out? Then what?
Well, I think the evidence will be out there and people will have to judge. I mean, I think the January 6th committee actually exceeded my expectations because there was a lot of kind of eye rolling and cynicism about what they were going to do. But I think they actually did manage to capture public attention. I think they did something incredibly valuable, which was to document what happened on January 6th and to show that this was not some random riot. This was not just some civil disturbance that got out of control, that this was actually an attempted coup d'etat by Donald Trump to overthrow the US government. I think a lot of us knew that anyway, but they actually got the evidence out there, and most of the evidence was from Republicans. Most of their witnesses were Republicans. So this didn't become a sounding board for Democrats who hate Trump. This became a way that Republicans, like the former Republican state house speaker in Arizona or others, could testify about what they saw themselves about Trump's attempts to overthrow the election. So I think that contributed to informing Democrats and independent voters about the threat that Trump and the MAGA Republicans pose to democracy. And I think, Biden was mocked for this, but I think he did a good job of amplifying those warnings with a couple of speeches on the threat to democracy. So I think, whatever happens with the January 6th committee report, I think the January 6th committee has done a good job of elevating the threats to democracy as a public issue.
Yeah. Do you think it played a role in the election? In the
Yeah,
vote?
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, to the extent that, democracy, again, was one of those sleeper issues like abortion that a lot of people said, oh, it's not going to matter. But I think it did matter. I think it did have an impact. And I think the January 6th committee certainly contributed to that.
All right. Let's see. Richard asks, what do you think about the emergence of anti-Semitic tropes in some of the Republican campaigns, Mastriani in Pennsylvania, his wife, etc.?
Well, it's very troubling to see. I mean, you're saying, according to the the ADL, you're seeing a large increase in anti-Semitism in the United States, which should not be surprising because you are seeing the Republican Party currying favor with the far right and embracing a lot of the tropes of the far right. I mean, Tucker Carlson is out there on Fox promulgating the great replacement theory that is, pushed by white supremacists, claiming that, a cabal of globalists or Jews or, evil elites are plotting to bring in people of color to replace white native born Americans. I mean, this is stuff that's, usually espoused by neo-Nazis, but you're hearing it in places like Fox News. So of course it's giving permission to anti-Semites to come out of the gutter and to assume a more prominent role. I mean, Trump plays with anti-Semitic tropes all the time. You have openly anti-Semitic candidates like Doug Mastriano. I mean, in fairness, I think there's also anti-Semitism on the left. So on the far left, which often in the form of anti-Zionism. The weird thing is you have anti-Semites on the right who claim to be great friends of Israel, and yet they're still anti-Semitic. But, I feel like, speaking as a Jew myself, I feel like Jews are really bringing people together, because I think one of the few things that the far left and the far right can agree on is they don't like Jews. And unfortunately, I think that's contributing to, you're seeing from both sides an increase in anti-Semitism, which is very troubling and beyond troubling. It's threatening, because I mean, you have like the slaughter in the synagogue in Pittsburgh. I think the danger is growing.
But there's a difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism.
Yeah, but I think they kind of the border between them gets kind of fuzzy. I mean, if you're saying that that the Jewish people have no right to a national homeland, whereas all these other people all over the world, they have a right to a national homeland, that to me doesn't seem like a position that you can take without any taint of anti-Semitism. But you can certainly, that's not to say you can't be critical of the state of Israel. I mean, I'm critical of the state of Israel. That's completely legitimate. But to say that Israel has no right to exist, I'm sorry, that to me is an anti-Semitic position.
Gloria asks, will Netanyahu's election divide the American Jewish community?
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, I think you're already seeing it happen. I think it's a lot of it, I think, is largely along religious lines, because Orthodox Jews and conservative Jews tend to be much more politically conservative. And I think you saw that about 30% of Jews, I think, in the exit poll said that they voted Republican this time, which is actually higher than normal. But I think, most secular Jews, I'm a secular Jew, I think most secular Jews tend to be much more liberal and don't like Netanyahu, don't like the direction that he is taking the country. And I think, Netanyahu is playing a very dangerous game because he's gotten embroiled in American politics. He's become very closely linked with Trump. He's become closely linked with Republicans. And I think by doing that, he is endangering the bipartisan support upon which Israel has always relied.
But there is no threat, right, to Israel on the part of foreign assistance, foreign aid from America with this election, is there, or do you think there is?
No, I don't see that. I mean, I think there's a little opposition to aid to Israel in Congress, most of it on the far left, but I don't think it's enough to affect the aid bills anytime soon. But I think if you look at support for Israel, it is really declining among younger progressives, among younger Democrats. I mean, as long as you have folks like the old timers, the Chuck Schumers and the Nancy Pelosi's and Steny Hoyers, I mean, yeah, they're going to be gung ho for Israel, but you're seeing younger, more progressive Democrats tend to be much more skeptical of Israel. So down the road, I think this is going to be a major problem for Israel. It's not right now, but 10 years down the road, yeah, I think it's going to be an issue.
Okay, what is your sense of the runoff between Raphael Warnock and Herschel Walker? Who wins that one?
Well, Reverend Warnock has experience winning runoffs in Georgia, so I would probably place my money on him. But I mean, I'm not a great prognosticator. But honestly, I am amazed that anybody that almost half of Georgia voters think that Herschel Walker is qualified to be in the U.S. Senate. I mean, that to me is astonishing. I mean, that's as astonishing as saying that Senator Warnock should be in the backfield for the University of Georgia. Okay, that's ridiculous, but it's just as ridiculous to say that Herschel Walker should be in the Senate. I mean, he just knows nothing about public policy. It's astonishing. But that, to me, the fact that he got like almost half the vote is really a tribute to tribalism, because in spite of all of his personal scandals, his lack of knowledge of politics, none of it matters. The only thing that half of Georgia voters care about is that he has an R after his name, and so they're just voting for the home team, basically.
Joe asks, is there any chance that a new McCarthy will emerge similar to his momentary courage post January 6th? Very momentary.
Yeah, it was it was a temporary lapse that he quickly overcame and went down to Mar-a-Lago to kowtow before the Orange Emperor. So I would be pleasantly surprised if I saw a new Kevin McCarthy emerge, but I certainly would not be holding my breath waiting for that to happen. I mean, in his political career, I don't see any sign of any political principles at all beyond the only principle that seems to govern him is self-promotion and self-interest. And I suppose if there's any hope for the party, it might be that a lot of these opportunists and self-seekers and self-promoters who have no real principles, in the last few years, they've adjusted their rhetoric to become very Trumpy, because that was the direction the party was going. But if the party starts going in a different direction now, I think they could easily adjust their rhetoric to say something else, because there's kind of a sense they don't really mean it. It's just whatever they say to gain power.
So I guess sort of a bigger, more existential question as put to you as a former Republican, what does it take to have a wholesale reinvention of where the party is going post-Trump? Would it take sustained losses at every level of government for the party to say, okay, we need to move in a different direction away from this extremism? Is that
I think it would.
It's not going to take a conscience, in other words.
Yeah, I think it's going to take much more sustained losses than what they've seen so far. I think the message that Republicans are basically getting from Tuesday's election, it's a mixed message. Yes, they're definitely seeing that Trump is a drag on the ticket, that having him campaign out there drives, away suburban moms, drives away independent voters. Bad for Republicans in general elections. But even if Trump were to go away, Trumpism, I think, has really taken root in the Republican Party. And look at Ron DeSantis, who is the most powerful figure after Trump within the GOP right now. DeSantis, I would say, is basically a Trumpist. He doesn't necessarily want to follow Trump. He may want to challenge Trump. That's a matter of personal ambition. but he has kind of adopted the Trump style of campaigning and governing, which is to basically become a culture warrior, to engage in these culture wars, to trigger Republican voters and attack, own the libs becomes the most important thing that you can do. And attack minority groups, LGBTQ people, or undocumented immigrants, or pick your favorite target and make them the subject.
I think wokeism.
Wokeism, right? Attack woke corporations. I mean, all this, so much nonsense. But again, this used to be a very marginal element of the Republican Party. This is what Pat Buchanan was espousing in 1992, when he still got a lot of votes, but he lost decisively to George H.W. Bush. But right now, Buchananism, which is now known as Trumpism, that has become the dominant element within the Republican Party. And that's going to be what's really hard to change. I mean, Trump is an old guy, okay? He's not going to be around forever. He's going to go away sooner or later, hopefully sooner. But even if he's not running for office, a lot of Republicans are still going to think that Trumpism is the way to win votes, unfortunately.
And in many cases it is.
In many cases it is, yeah. I mean, because the reality is you're seeing that, if you look at the exit polls, the percentage of the electorate on Tuesday that was white, it was still like, I don't know, 75%, something like that. It was a pretty heavily white electorate, and Republicans win like 60% of white votes. I mean, amazing statistic is the last time that Democrats won a majority of the white vote in a presidential election, that was 1964. So try to wrap your mind around that. You've seen college-educated whites are actually trending to the Democratic Party, but working-class whites are trending to the Republican Party. And there's a lot more working-class whites than there are college-educated whites, because only about a third of Americans have gone to college. And so that's the base that the Republican Party appeals to. And it's been pretty successful. And they're even winning over some Latinos and non-white voters with that kind of red meat, blue collar appeal.
Right. But then you look at the popular vote for the past presidential elections, and going all the way back to the 90s, with the exception of Kerry Bush, Bush 2, the Democrat has won the popular vote.
Right. But as we know, it often doesn't matter, because the Electoral College is stacked in favor of red states. And so they're able to outperform in the Electoral College beyond what their popularity would suggest. The same thing is true in the Senate. I mean, if you had, a Senate by proportional representation, probably, 70-80% of the seats would be Democrats, not Republicans. But obviously right now it's 50-50, and it's probably going to stay that way.
So that means deadlock until who knows when, in terms of actually getting policies through?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of, in some ways you could argue it's a status quo election, but I think the good news for Biden is I don't think he has that much of a legislative agenda anyway left, because he's already accomplished a lot of it in the first 2 years. And so I think from his perspective, if he's going to run again, in some ways he has a perfect foil now in the Republican Congress, in the Republican House, that he's going to, like Harry Truman, he can run against the do-nothing Republicans, and that could actually, work to his benefit, or to whoever becomes the Democratic nominee in 2024.
Okay, we are at the end of our hour, but do you want to end on a positive note in any way?
Yeah, I think I don't have to manufacture it. And in the past, I would kind of have to strain to find the positive element. But look, I think the news yesterday was pretty positive. I think I'm kind of a one-issue voter. My issue is defending democracy. And I think it was a pretty good day for American democracy, in spite of the fact that there were a bunch of election deniers were elected. They weren't elected to the most important posts where they can actually steal the next election. And I think there was a lot of the electorate recoiled from these crazy election deniers. So I think, yeah, I'm not somebody who's Pollyannish. I've been actually pretty pessimistic about American democracy, but I'm actually a little bit more optimistic after yesterday than I was the day before. And I actually have greater respect for the wisdom of the voters than I had, a few days ago. I think actually it was a better outcome than we could have expected.
All right. Well, that's a good note to end on. Max Booth, thank you so much for being back with us. It was a great
Pleasure.
conversation. I appreciate your words and your thoughts, and I love reading your column. So it's a pleasure to see you in person.
Always a privilege. Thank you, Madeleine. Great questions.
Thank you. And don't forget, there is a virtual and live 2-hour election postmortem next Tuesday at the Skirball Center in Los Angeles, KPCC's. Larry Mantle will be hosting that. So you can watch it on the internet, on Zoom, as you do normally, or you can attend in person, and we'll provide you an email link for that. And again, that is next week, Tuesday, November 15th at 5 o'clock Pacific. Thank you so much for being here. Wish you all the best, good health, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.